All right.
Okay.
There we go. And recording.
Excellent. Okay, well, hi everyone. I'm going to try and address both sides of the room, which is going to be a little bit challenge. But hello, my name's Grace. I think most of you know me. I'm a law student. I have a real interest in law and technology, so I took a research subject on that last year, which was fascinating. I ended up doing a research project specializing on neurotechnology and human rights, which is why I've decided to present about that tonight. So it's quite a spooky area. In my view, it feels a little bit like sci-fi, but it's real, it's happening, and it's something that a lot of lawyers are starting to take quite seriously. So I wanted to talk to you about, firstly, kind of what it is, how it's being used, some of the risks and harms that might be associated with it, and then some different legal approaches to protecting people from those harms. I've tried to make this presentation a bit fun and like full of images. So there's pop art images generated by ChatGPT's DALL-E 2 connection.
We love appropriate crediting.
Yay, we love credit, yeah, for AI images. So so I've focused in both on the paper that I wrote and also the structure and content of the paper written by the Australian Human Rights Commission in March of this year, when it did its report on neurotechnology. So I'm starting with the definition it used for what is neurotechnology: devices and procedures used to assess, monitor, investigate, assess, manipulate and or emulate the structure and function of the neural systems of natural persons. So it's a pretty broad definition, and it doesn't make a lot of sense in its abstract definition there. So I've got a stack of examples to try and show you a little bit more about the potential uses and the actual current uses. Oh no, hang on. Control Z, I want to move that. Click the wrong thing. Okay, moving across. So I'll start with some of the current uses. These are uses that, you know, are absolutely proven. They're like on the market. They're things that, have been demonstrated to work. And the most kind of well-known and or scary version of neurotechnology is brain implants. So actual invasive implanted things, but then there's also external to the skull types of technology. So I've given examples of both of those here. So one use that is possible with Neuralink implants at the moment is enabling people to control computers with their minds. Another is enabling people to control prosthetic limbs, which Nathan Copeland used to give Obama a fist bump in, I believe, 2016 at a tech demo. So it's been around for a little while now. It can also, this is one of the uses I'm really excited about, it can translate brain activity to speech and also facial expressions. So I've again put so many links here. You can go and watch the videos and like see the articles, but this one is about helping a stroke victim speak again. You can also use what they're nicknaming brain pacemakers to deliver on-demand deep brain stimulation, which is being used to treat severe treatment-resistant depression, otherwise treatment-resistant depression. And then another use of an external brain device, these are all internal. An external one is monitoring fatigue in workers. So that's used with heavy machinery operators and like truck drivers and things like that. So again, all of these have links, so you can go and check my facts. So then another category I've got here is types that are being tested and being developed. So these, maybe aren't yet fully developed, but the concept might have been proven a little bit, or there might be like companies working on it, and there's some evidence to suggest that that'll be possible. So the US military, for example, is looking at non-invasive neurotech to augment human abilities, which sounds a little bit vague. So I've given their explanation here. I don't know if that's big enough for you guys to read. Yeah. Let's see. So they're saying that such interfaces would help enable technology for diverse national security applications like control of unmanned aerial vehicles and active cyber defense systems, and also teaming with computer systems to multitask during military missions. This one is sort of related to this, but monitoring attention and focus in the workplace and also in schools. So there are some Chinese schools that have investigated using external headbands to monitor children's attention levels. I know it's wild. This Harvard Business Review article is a really good summary of some of the uses of these types of technologies. This one has been proven, but only in sort of 1 or 2 research studies. So you can implant false fearful memories into mice, and that impacts their behavior and their habits going forward.
Why would you do that?
You can start to see some of the really horrifying implications of this tech as I go across this this table. And then another suggested use that's being researched at the moment is ways to immerse people more deeply in gaming and the metaverse. So there's a company called Next Mind, which is focusing on designing ways to let people push virtual buttons by focusing on to immerse them in the metaverse. So these are all ones where there actually is a fair bit of science behind them. There's a bit of evidence to show that like it can be done. The guy who ran this false fearful memories into mice studies, one of the studies, he is really influential in this neurorights space, and he's shaping the debate quite a bit, partially on the basis that his work was quite frightening to himself. He called it an Oppenheimer moment when he realized that you could implant false memories by using this tech. So gives you a sense of what the scientific community is kind of making of it. So now we'll move across to the more speculative uses. So these are ones that are mentioned in the literature as possible uses, or mentioned by company owners as directions that they want to go. So brain-to-brain interaction and telepathy is one that Elon Musk's Neuralink is actively investigating. Their current focus is kind of enabling contact with computers and solutions for people who are paralyzed and so on. But his stated goal, the company's stated goal, is to get to this point of brain-to-brain interaction, which is wild. This is a big one that gets a lot of attention in literature, particularly in that Australian Human Rights Commission paper that I mentioned at the start. So criminal justice applications. For example, there's been a lot of theorizing about using implants to control and counteract violent impulses in violent criminals. So if there's a spike in those sorts of emotions, perhaps we could counter it before it has real world ramifications. There's a lot of ethical murkiness around that, but that is one suggested use. Other applications in the criminal justice space could be improving lie detection tests like polygraphs and assisting memory retrieval in the courtroom for witnesses. And then finally, another speculative use is targeted advertising based on your neurochemical signals. So your brain tells you you're hungry or you're tired, and the Human Rights Commission suggests that those signals could be used to directly market products to you, which is very sci-fi, very dystopia in my view. So we'll go on to why I think we should be a little bit worried, or at least cautious, about neurotechnology. So one of the most sort of simple and obvious risks is that it's risky and it's unproven. It messes with a really important organ in our body, as particularly the invasive implants that actually get inserted into your brain. Elon Musk's Neuralink company has killed like a bunch of monkeys and pigs by trying them out. But also, you can imagine surgeons are so careful with what they cut and what they remove and what they sort of move around, because the brain is quite a mystery to us, and harming it can harm us in unpredictable ways. But then other more sort of human rights, leaning towards human rights based harms, invasions of privacy. So if technology can tell what we're thinking and can, for example, translate thought to speech, then mind reading is quite a real possibility in the future, as sci-fi as that sounds. Also, the targeted advertising, I think, has a real risk of invading our privacy. And it sort of has ties to the discrimination stuff I'll talk about in a moment. There's also, I didn't put in this list, but there is a study that's showing they can put some electrodes on your head, and they can, if you think about your PIN number for your credit card, they can accurately pick up what those numbers are, which is crazy. Like, that's existing tech. So there's a lot of reasons, I think, to be a little bit concerned about the privacy implications. There's also challenges to freedom of thought and autonomy, which is sort of related. So if we have technology that's able to implant false memories, if we have technology that's able to influence your emotional reactions, like those potential speculative uses in the criminal justice system, then it poses real threats to our freedom of thought and our ability to make autonomous decisions. And then the final, or not really the final, but another of the major possible risks is discrimination. So I think I speak about this a little bit more later in the piece too, but there's kind of 2 or 3 forms of discrimination that the literature is starting to express concern about. So one is where, well, no, I won't spoil it. I'm sure I put it later in the thing, but basically it's like about if your mental capacities are different to the people around you, then you might be discriminated against when tech is able to like invade your brain and read that and see that your brain signals are a bit different to others. So then, based on these risks, there's some examples both domestically, this is the Australian Human Rights Commission paper that I mentioned, and also internationally. This is a 2023 International Conference on the Ethics of Neurotechnology. There are quite a lot of these international meetings starting to happen as international organizations, you know, clock this emerging risk that's sort of advancing in lockstep with AI. So a lot of the risks generalize across both. A lot of AI development will inform neurotechnological development too, in terms of their like accurate interpretation of brain signals and so on. Okay, so we've talked about the harm. So then we need, in my view, some kind of response. And that's the view of these international lawyers and domestic lawyers who've been considering the problem as well. In the paper that I prepared last year, I mapped out 4 characteristics that I think a response to the risks of neurotechnology needs to have. So the first is rapidity, because technology develops so quickly. So we have the same sort of issue with AI. It's developing really, really quickly. Legal systems aren't always set up to develop in that rapid way. And yeah, like the applications of neurotech changing every day, they're evolving and getting more sophisticated. So a legal response needs to be able to, you know, be thrown together quite quickly. At the same time, we need a solution that is durable and broad, so it can catch future changes in neurotechnology. It can last a really long time. It can apply to a really broad range of tech. Without us having to generate a new law every time there's like a subtle shift in the different applications of novel neurotechnology. In the same, sorry?
Is one or two not like mutually exclusive thing? Like the idea that
Like we need to develop it rapidly and it needs to apply for a long time.
yeah, or like if it's gonna be changing all the time, how can it apply for everything?
Well, that's what I'm going to talk about later in the
Okay,
piece,
cool.
Rishi.
Cool.
But basically I'm going to talk about human rights mechanisms as a possible instrument that can be developed rapidly but apply for a really long time. Yeah, so other characteristics, it needs to apply universally. So across the world, I think is a better option than having them apply domestically, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. And there also needs to be an element of cultural recognition, because one problem that I found in the literature, in the research, as I did my paper last year, was that some cultures have different concepts of what autonomy looks like, what free will looks like, how important independence is. Some cultures also might assert a right to interference with their minds. So think, for example, of ritual, like hypnosis or drug use, or kind of, religious rituals that alter your mind a bit. If we design laws that aren't culturally sensitive, they could block people from practicing those sort of legitimate forms of cultural practice. So, yeah, do you have a question? Okay, yeah. So I think those are kind of the relevant things. So then there's 2 pathways I think we can use to bring in human rights response to neurotechnology, and I believe that a human rights response matches those characteristics that I've mapped out as being important. So one way is to use existing human rights. This is an AI generated image, so it's kind of broke, but it's got the essential parts there, you know. Existing human rights. So some rights that researchers have suggested might be affected by neurotechnology would be the right to privacy, freedom of many types, things like freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, religion and belief, and then also rights to inequality and non-discrimination. And those rights are really some of the most central, they call them negative rights. So it's a right to not have them interfered with, as opposed to a positive right, which means you have to provide something actively. But these are like fundamental ones that underlie a lot of different broadly accepted human rights instruments, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and also this, the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Just to delve a little bit more into the possible forms of discrimination, like I alluded to before, there are sort of these three main categories that have cropped up in the literature as areas of concern. One is against people with disabilities who elect not to use neurotechnology when it is available to, like, quote unquote, correct their condition, which is analogous to the current debate about cochlear implants, which my dad actually has for his profound deafness. So it's one that's close to my heart. But cochlear implants and deafness is a cultural identity. So where deaf communities have formed, they've developed their own languages of sign. They've developed, just like little enclaves and communities. When cochlear implants are sort of thrust upon them as the only solution to make them like fit in with hearing people, it can be really offensive to people, members of the deaf community. And we can see how that could have far-reaching implications when we have neurotechnologies that can power prosthetic limbs, when we have perhaps neurotech that can restore other senses, and so on. Another possible form of discrimination is against neurodivergent people whose different thought patterns are revealed by workplace attention trackers. So people with ADHD, for example, who are thinking differently, that could conceivably crop up on an attention tracker if it was used at a school or in a workplace, and lead to forms of discrimination, which ideally would be caught by existing non-discrimination laws, but it's definitely something that we need to sort of think about and be prepared for. And then the final form is a little bit more speculative, but because there is so much research and so much work going on about enhancing people's existing abilities with novel neurotechnologies, there's some speculation in the literature that there might be a new era of discrimination against those who choose not to or can't afford to use neurotechnology to enhance their own cognitive abilities. So if everyone's got the cool new groovy like telepathy implant or whatever Elon Musk's Neuralink is working on, then potentially we're heading for a different era of discrimination where that would be a new axis of disadvantage. And so these are the rights that might be affected, and they're delving into the discrimination there. These are a couple of examples of ways that you can enforce your human rights. So some countries or states, as in Queensland's case, have their own human rights instruments. Ours was only brought in quite recently in 2019. There's also kind of stirrings and advocacy for a federal Human Rights Act across Australia.
And what do we have before 2019?
Nothing. We didn't have human
Genuinely.
rights. Yeah, we didn't have human rights. There weren't domestic human rights protections, although Australia was a signatory to things like the ICCPR and the Universal Declaration before then. So there were other mechanisms. Yeah. But yeah, so like within Queensland now, you can complain to the agency that you believe is breached your human rights. You can go to the Human Rights Commission. You can go through courts and use that as a course of action. So you can say, my rights been breached. I believe though in Queensland the complication is we have a piggyback form of human rights protection, so you need to have a separate cause of action already and then piggyback a human rights complaint onto that. It's not its own standalone cause of action to say that my right to privacy has been breached. Yeah. But then there's also international mechanisms. So when individuals live in countries which have ratified this treaty and also its first optional protocol, optional being the operative word, not every country has, they can complain directly to the UN Human Rights Commission. So that happened, for example, in Australia, in a case called Daniel, Billy and Others versus Australia, where a group of Torres Strait Islander people took Australia to the Human Rights Commission to complain that their right to life, their right to culture, and a few other things are being breached by climate change in the Torres Strait. However, so that the Human Rights Commission found that Australia had breached their rights, which is crazy.
Australia as in like Australian government?
Australian government, yeah. So they said that the Australian government as a whole, and then also like the corporations that it controls with regulations had pumped out a bunch of carbon dioxide and been careless to the harm that would have. But you can critique using this mechanism because Australia has done like not that much in the wake of the Billion Australian decision, which was in 2022. They haven't really done anything to compensate those people. It's just like an on paper decision, really. So it doesn't hold a huge amount of weight. I think the domestic mechanism in that way, Queensland is a bit stronger. So yeah, we can use existing human rights.
Do you want to pause just for 2 seconds?
Yeah.
I know Kyle's really keen to.
Oh yeah,
He's just trying to
sure.
be right in.
No worries. Okay, we're just gonna pause for 1 moment.
And
for
then
food
we'll
coming.
we'll grab our stuff.
That's fine. Yeah. Does anyone have questions so far, or like?
Did you go to the Brisbane Science Festival last? was it this year or last year?
I don't know if I've been previously. I don't know if I went this year.
Yeah, because that was all about neurotech as well.
It's
I
a
think
really hot topic.
it was like-
yeah, there was a seminar at UQ on it recently that I couldn't get to, and I was
Yeah.
down this
Big
year.
dialogue? Big dialogue? What is that? No, that was
No.
the social media.
Yes.
It's the big sort of emerging issue.
Yeah,
I think
'cause
AI.
they had like 2 different mechanisms that could read your like read your thoughts. There was like
Yeah, there's a lot of-
EEGs, and then there was one that was more invasive.
Exactly. Yeah, so EEG is a pretty common one that we've already used in medicine for a long time.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of
Yeah, but they trained it with just like huge neural networks.
yeah, and now you can pick up a lot more
That's
stuff
right,
like
yeah,
people's
you
bank
can- Yeah.
details, yeah, and pin numbers and stuff.
Very interesting.
It is cooked, yeah. What were you saying? Oh yeah, I didn't really have time to get into it earlier in the piece, but in my paper I spoke about how there's neurotech that can like read the brain signals, and then there's also a different category that, you know, influences the brain. And it's fascinating because one of the earliest forms of using electrical stimulation from outside of your skull was holding, it was in like the 1600s, I believe. It was a very long time ago that people discovered that if you hold electric eels to your forehead, it helps with migraines because it kind of like does a bit of a reset, like the electrical stimulation. So there's some scientific backdrop to it. There's like historical practice that shows
It also helps with
neurostimulation can be helpful.
extreme terror.
Yeah,
Grossness.
yeah, like feels for sure.
All right, should we
Okay, I didn't say anything more in the presentation. I'm just
Yeah,
answering
Oh,
Let's just open them and we'll leave some for Grace. Which ones do you want more?
the veggie.
The veggie ones? Okay. We'll just
Okay.
have them go through.
Yeah, so we just kind of wrapped up talking about the existing human rights mechanisms that people could use to protect themselves. And then the other kind of newer solution in the human rights space that's been proposed is novel neuro rights, what they're calling neuro rights. So the Neuro Rights Foundation is run by, I'm blanking on his name, Raphael someone, who was one of the scientists involved in the mice memory implant experiments. And he was sort of horrified by the possible implications of that, the ethical dilemmas that cropped up for him. And so he founded this Neuro Rights Foundation and basically like travels around the world going to all these different conferences and working with different governments to suggest that they should implement these 5 new neuro rights. So these are like brief extracts from their longer explanations on their website that's linked here. But the first is mental privacy. So they say that the sale, commercial transfer and use of neural data should be strictly regulated. They keep it relatively vague because it would be implemented at perhaps a domestic level or in an international treaty. So they say things like strictly regulated, the details to be worked out, later. Personal identity, they say, these are all direct quotes, they say neurotechnology could blur the line between a person's consciousness and external technological inputs. The right to free will, they say that individuals should have ultimate control of their own decision-making without manipulation. This is a really interesting one, fair access to mental augmentation. So this is in response to the discrimination against non-enhanced people that I discussed previously. And they suggest that we should have guidelines guaranteeing equality of access to neurotechnologies, which is problematic in a few ways, as I'll go into in a moment. And then finally, they say protections from bias. They say countermeasures to combat bias should be the norm for algorithms in neurotechnology. So again, it's very similar to the debates that we're having about AI and the types of bias that we're seeing creep into the algorithms there in that space. So how to introduce those rights? It could be internationally via the United Nations or via another international decision-making and negotiation forum. For example, I believe there's a Neuro Rights Convention hosted by the UK, I want to say, that was more of a regional one. So there's potential for like the EU or like a regional body to say, well, we're negotiating our own thing for our part of the world, which is an incomplete, like imperfect sort of protection, but it's still, yeah, progress. And then another possibility is domestically. So countries or states within countries can introduce their own neuro rights protection. So we saw before that Queensland in 2019 introduced the Queensland Human Rights Act, but 2 areas so far have also introduced explicit neuro rights protection. So Chile was one of the ones that the founder of the Neuro Rights Foundation was working really closely with, trying to advocate for this change. So they passed a neuro rights law. They introduced a constitutional amendment, which is really a huge deal in law. And they also applied it in a Supreme Court ruling against an American corporation. So they said that a corporation had to delete a consumer's neural data that they were storing, and I believe pay some sort of compensation as well.
Wow.
Do they need a whole of country vote on that, like, or,
The constitutional amendment.
yeah,
Well, I'm not certain. I'm not super familiar with constitutional like procedures in Chile. I would imagine so, but the law.
Why aren't you?
I would expect
Sorry
that.
guys, I'm so sorry. That's my bad. I don't know much about Chilean constitution. I'm just throwing it in there as an example. Anyway, but they have this neuro rights law. They've applied it, and also California has really recently amended the California Consumer Privacy Act. So they bounced off an existing piece of legislation, and they just inserted 2 critical words. They included neural data under personal sensitive information. So all of the protections in that act. Also not super familiar with those guys, but there are protections in that act. You're testing me. Those protections now apply to neural data as well. So, yeah, that's one avenue that sort of can be taken. So I'm going to wrap up by talking about some of the problems with a rights-based approach. I think currently it's one of the best avenues available to us, but it's not a perfect solution. So I don't want to sell it as like flawless. So I did a bit of thinking. I thought of about 10 or so problems with a rights-based approach. Some of these are specific to neuro rights. Some of these are generally criticisms of rights-based systems. So rights inflationism is a term that crops up in the papers on this topic quite a bit. And this is the theory that having too many rights will devalue them.
That's so interesting.
We already have quite a lot of human rights treaties. There's 18 in force at the moment. And countries sort of ratify them to different levels. I don't know if you guys know what ratifying means in this context.
No,
I'm
explain.
doing international law recently, so I feel like it's just in my brain. So some countries are, I feel like I'm just going to regurgitate all my international law stuff, but some countries are monist. So whenever there's a change to international law, they automatically integrate it into their domestic law. So Belgium, for example, I think, does that. East Timor, a few different countries like that. So when there's a change in the international law space, they just bang it straight into their own domestic legislation. In Australia, in the US, in Germany, in many other countries, we have a dualist system. So we treat international law as being separate from our domestic law. Our government is free to legislate inconsistently with international law, but they just have to face the consequences from other countries via the UN and so on. But it means that we will like sign it at a UN convention, but it doesn't have any much force in Australia until we ratify it. So the government has to like implement legislation to bring those treaty provisions home, to Australia. So anyway, so there's this theory that like having too many rights devalues them. That also there's a concept called compliance fatigue, something along those lines, where it's like we have so many human rights treaties with all these different obligations, and it can be expensive to implement them. It can be time intensive. It can has all these downsides for countries, and so that's like an aspect to rights inflationism as well. It also can be a difficult and a lengthy process to debate an international human rights treaty and then get enough countries to sign the treaty for it to enter into force. So once you've got the words on the page, at say a big UN meeting, that's not enough. You need to get a certain number of countries to sign on to it to bring it into force. And so there's examples of treaties where they've negotiated the wording and then it's taken years after that for enough countries to be like, yeah, this is a priority, we're going to sign it. There's also, this is an increasing trend in the world that I'm actually quite worried about. There's backlash against international regulation in general due to this perceived clash with domestic sovereignty of nations. So Brexit was an example of that. The UK pushed back against the EU's perceived interference with its sovereignty because there were these like external laws that shaped, for example, their emissions reduction targets and things like that they got really pissy about and decided to leave the EU over. Trump has obviously very recently been re-elected and he has very critical views of the UN. He has threatened before to sort of pull out several major treaties. And yeah, I mean, that's just an ongoing trend against all sorts of human rights, not just neuro rights. The US also has a bad record on ratifying human rights treaties. So I don't know if you can see these numbers here, but there's like these 18 human rights treaties. This color coding shows how many different countries have ratified. Most have ratified above 5. I can't really spot any red. I don't know, there might be 1 or 2. But like in the 5 to 9 range, that's where the US sits, along with countries like, you know, India and PNG and different countries scattered around. And the problem with that is that the US is quite a hub for technological development in every area, including neurotech. So if it's not like on board with this idea of neuro rights and it decides not to ratify it, or like sign it and then ratify it domestically, then like what level of protection will it give us?
That's a question on that. South America is
Yeah.
way higher on certifications than I would have expected it to be. Are they
Yeah.
quite like a modest continent where like a lot of its countries are like, oh, we'll sign everything sort of thing?
I don't know, but I mean, things to note are signing a treaty doesn't necessarily mean that you
Do it.
do it.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you can sign it and you can
Yeah.
not be compliant. You
Yeah.
can also you can use reservations and declarations to limit the number of obligations under the treaty that apply to you. So for example, the UAE and Sultanate of Oman, they really didn't like the international treaty about the rights of or like discrimination against women. It's like called the CEDAW, so Convention on Ending Discrimination Against Women, I think it's called. And so they submitted these really vast reservations that stripped the treaty of a lot of its effects. They were like, yeah, we'll sign it, it can apply to our country, but only in this limited form.
Right.
And there's this kind of trend at the UN level to prioritize universal adherence to some degree instead of uniform application of it. Yeah, so they kind of like trying to balance this trade-off of it's not perfect, but if they, yeah. So anyway, my point is maybe South America is using those mechanisms, or maybe it's just super human rights conscious. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of a problem. US has a bad track record. It's also a problem because we can see here in Southeast Asia, quite a lot of countries haven't, you know, signed on to some of these treaties. So say we implement some brand new neurotech, neuro rights treaty, this brand spanking new thing, and this whole part of the world or sort of swathes that elect not to sign it. The worrying implications of that I can see are these sort of attention monitoring and privacy invading tech could be used could be developed, yeah, certainly in these places, or used on like factory workers and people who you know, so there'll be like all this great protection in Australia and we'll be chilling, and then like all these other areas maybe won't have the same level of protection, which could be really concerning. It's also, there's another analogy to the AI regulatory space. So I did a research project on this over my summer break when I was in Denmark with an Australian professor and lawyer who works in this AI regulatory space. And what we found is that there's a bit of a race to the bottom going on with tech regulation, because having less regulation actually encourages companies to develop tech in your country. So Australia right now has a bunch, well, at least when I did the research project, it may have changed since, but they only have this really vague, like optional light set of AI principles that were like aspirational. So it wasn't very strong regulation because Australia wants to attract the money and the business of companies developing this type of tech here. Whereas the EU, for example, was really on top of it and really restrictive, and they were like, well, we don't want to, let it develop unfettered. But this is, global trend. It's expensive and it's hard to implement positive rights. And that is a partial explanation for this ratification pattern that we see across the world. So wealthy countries are more like financially able to provide positive rights, things like, a right to housing or a right to healthcare or a right to whatever. They can just like afford it basically, whereas other countries may go, we'd love to do that, but it's like impossible. Signing that sort of treaty will just mean that we're always violating our commitments because we don't have the resources. So if we implement something like a right to cognitive enhancement, and I alluded to this before that it's a little bit problematic, it means that some countries might not be able to give effect to those rights, and it will be a bit useless. It's just on paper. Another thing is that it may not be a priority for the UN right now because there's so much going on. There's a lot of problems facing the world, there's a lot of conflict. There are a lot of big emerging issues. Climate change is a massive focus and priority, a lot of environmental issues, and a lot of international conflict. So it may not be top of the list, and I can kind of understand that. But it is definitely an emerging threat, in my view, to human rights. So we need to be creative and work around that. So potentially implementing it at a regional and domestic level is better than nothing, but it does mean then there's inconsistent patchwork of protection. And again, we'd see this pattern of some countries could be left more vulnerable to exploitation by countries with stronger rights protections. Okay, so that's kind of where I'll end for today. This is my presentation. It's got loads of links throughout, so if you have a chance, I'd encourage you to click through them and explore. Yeah, I can show you the
Some of your favorite ones of those.
yeah,
That's
maybe.
amazing.
This one is about someone who was unable to speak for years talked using a new brain implant. So this one, I believe it had a limited vocabulary. I want to say but yeah, I imagine. So this one was given the choice of 50 words. The algorithm was 95% accurate. And then when it had a repertoire of around 1,000, accuracy fell to 75%. And then they predicted that giving it a vocabulary of 40,000 would produce an accuracy rate of 72%. So it's still pretty good for changing brain signals into speech. In my view, that's really good. And then this is the video, which I think is beautiful.
My nurse is right outside. I'm not hungry.
Well, yeah.
I am going outside. It is right here.
Yeah, so it's a photo test that they performed with this tech to see if it worked. She had, I believe, she has a neurodegenerative disease. She's had it for 11 years. So she hasn't been able to talk for 11 years. She's lost the ability to control her facial muscles, but her intention to form words is unimpaired. So she understands language and she can produce it in this way by thinking about the words that she wants to say, which is fascinating. Yeah. How do I, hang on, let's
145,000 words, 70%.
It's pretty good. Hey, it's pretty good. Also, another one that I found really cool was this one about Nathan Copeland giving Obama a fist bump.
That's more than usually.
Wow.
So this is a little video.
Many words.
Simplify your social media game with SEMrush Social. Be everywhere your audience is with seamless platform management. Post smarter with audience and competitor insights, and save time with automated reporting.
Nathan is moving this hand with his right. And so when he was giving me a fist bump or shaking my hand, these are his own signals that he's sending out that are manipulating what's, pretty amazing precision. what this robotic arm does. But in addition, what's also very cool is that when I'm moving the hand, it is also sending signals to Nathan so that he is feeling me touching and pulling on this robotic arm.
Oh, sorry. I know. What are some other examples in here? Yeah, these are mostly sort of articles that you can read that just describe what's going on.
There's really cool media and Nolan to us in the first guy in Neurotech and Planet. Because he's
Yeah.
got a lot of like this for journalism.
Yeah.
So
It's pretty interesting stuff. My personal interest in this field, it started with this guy called Neil Harbison, who my interest was kind of piqued because he has the same name as my grandpa, but he is not in fact my grandpa. He's
So close.
so close.
like your like
He's this guy.
full name the same as your grandpa.
It's, yeah, except my grandpa has
He looks
one
just
S.
like your grandpa.
Wow. But he is fascinating. I saw a TED talk about him, and he sort of bills himself as the first cyborg. Yeah, it's the world's first legally recognized cyborg. Is his
Legally
is his-
recognized.
Yeah. So he's born completely colorblind, but he has this device attached to his head that turns color into sound. So he listens to the sound profiles of different things. Is this gonna load? Maybe. I don't know. It's a really fascinating TED talk. I won't play the whole thing. You should watch it because it's wild. Oh.
Thanks.
Oh my god, you have the child locked on.
Reports from scratch or templates.
I appreciate this video sweet Tony.
That's good. That makes me feel good.
What are your thoughts on keys? This week that is well done.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is no Hobson.
Well, I was born with a rare visual condition called achromatopsia, which is total color blindness. So I've never seen color, and I don't know what color looks like because I come from a grayscale world. To me, the sky is always gray, flowers are always gray, and television is still in black and white. But since the age of 21, instead of seeing color, I can hear color. In 2003, I started a project with computer scientist Adam Montandon, and the result, with further collaborations with Peter Queche from Slovenia and Matias Lizana from Barcelona, is this electronic eye. It's a color sensor that detects the color frequency in front of me and sends this frequency to a chip installed at the back of my head, and I hear the color in front of me through the bone, through bone conduction. So for example, if I have like, this is the sound of purple. For example, this is the sound of grass. It's red, like that. This is the sound of a dirty sock.
That's weird.
Just like yellow, this one. So I've been hearing color all the time for 8 years since the time.
It's fascinating. He does, no, it's great because he does like playlists of his friends' faces. He does like mixtapes of the colors and
Oh, that's really
Sick.
and then he can show you what
A diss track.
yeah, like the song sounds like
in color.
in color. So like babies,
Wait,
like
that's
Justin Bieber, he can
wild.
like show you it's all these shades of pink on his
That's
sound
so
scale.
interesting.
It's
That's so
great,
funny.
guys.
I really want to see what the sound scale is because you'd have to take a like
I
color
wanna
doesn't
say,
fit like a one dimensional line.
Baby color scale. Let's see if I can.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Wanna go
Yes.
through
I mean, unless you
whereas
do like.
frequency of sound is one dimensional.
I don't know if this is. Come on.
Yeah, look at solo
Just color.
Solo chromatic.
Yeah, it's
I
really
used
chromatic.
to- You don't have, maybe you don't consider shade.
You know where to find it.
Just consider
Yeah,
just color.
But you can see like the diagram here.
Also,
This is how you use it.
saturation
Yeah.
or shade.
Anyway,
So
so
it's
that's
like
my
a-
that's my little
Yeah, it's just
presentation.
like around.
I think I'll pause the recording now.